University on There Is No Socialism in on a Dead Planet. As an organisation, Anti-Capitalist Resistance is absolutely committed to the fight around trying to stop irreversible runaway climate change, and we see that as a central task of socialists today. So this isn't the first discussion we've had on this issue, but it is, and it also certainly won't be the last. There is going to be a series of protests and actions around the COP26 mobilization in early November. So at the very least, there is a protest on the 6th of November. There'll be a series of protests, big ones in Glasgow and London, as well as regional ones around the country. So we hope to see you on one of those protests, and we'll obviously be sending out information around that. If you are not on any of our email lists, then Simon Pearson is going to post up something in the chat if you would like to give us your email, just so that we can send you details of future meetings in case you're not already getting that. So for the final session, I want to welcome two guest speakers. We've got Tárzia, who will be speaking. She will be speaking in Spanish first with translation, and then we have Maggie joining us as well. So thank you very much, Maggie. So we will start with Tárzia. You have around 12 minutes each.
Hang on, Simon. I need to explain the interpretation to people who are not to using it. So Tárzia will be speaking in Spanish. That means that those of you who, well, actually, whatever language you want to look in, at the bottom of your screen, you should see a globe. You click on the globe and you either click on EN for English or ES for Spanish, depending which language you want to listen in.
Okay, is everyone clear on that? Can everyone see the interpretation globe at the bottom? It's next to the leave button. Do not click the leave button by accident. Okay, so Tárzia will speak first. I will hold up a sign which will say that you have 5 minutes left, and then 1 for 1 minute left, kind of like wrap up. Okay, so Tárzia, we'd like to begin. Thank you very much.
¿Puedo hablar ahorita?
Can I speak now? Can you hear me? Can everyone hear the interpretation? Good morning from Toronto, Canada. I have to look at Simon. Did I get that right? To see how much time I have left? I think that's correct. Where are you, Simon?
Me.
Where are you? There you are.
Yeah.
Okay, I see you. Great. Let's get going, says Tárzia. First, I'd like to thank you for inviting me to speak at this meeting. Thank you to the organization. Thanks to Terry, of course. I've been an activist with Terry now for many years. I think goes back many years as an eco-socialist. My name is Tárzia, and I live here in Brazil, in the northeastern region of Brazil, very near the equator. In fact, it's very hot here. And I've been an activist more than 20 years in the World March of Women, and also a member of a local organization, a local environmentalist organization that organizes the peoples here in the semi-arid region where I live, called An Articulação Semiária Brasileña. And on the basis of this work, well, we've been trying to organize population communities in these especially indigenous areas in this region of Brazil. And so we've combined the feminist struggle with the eco-socialist struggle. This has really become one of the pillars of our work. And I'm also on the national leadership of PSOL, which is the Socialism and Freedom Party here in Brazil. And I'm part of an internal current called Comuna, which is part of the Brazilian section of the Fourth International. And so I'm really delighted to speak with you about our struggle here in Brazil, about eco-socialist struggles, and all the different social and environmental struggles that are here in Brazil. I would say going back some 2 years now, we have a government which is not only a genocidal government, is also an ecocidal government, a government whose very government project is to exterminate anything that has anything to do with the structural conditions required for biomass, for ecology here in Brazil, that tries to chase people off their lands, off their territories, as part of the government's so-called developmentalist projects to further initiatives that are attacks against these peoples, against our regions, against our ecosystems. And this has to do with the specific situation in Brazil, of course, but also it has to do with the situation in the entire Latin American region. And perhaps we should also say the situation the world over, because this is very much tied to life of one of the main biomes in the world, the Amazon region. Of course, there are other regions in the world that are important, but of course, the Amazon plays an important role in Brazil and in the world. In recent years, under the Bolsonaro government, even before Bolsonaro, it should be said, we had tried to organize struggles against other local development models here in Brazil. But after Brazil took power, things just deteriorated on a massive scale. In fact, there are these attacks I mentioned that seek to exterminate the communities, the peoples who are on the front lines of resistance against the government's ecocidal aims. Here in Brazil, we're seeing a very worrying, a very serious situation with the forward march of mining sectors who have been given the authorization of the federal government of Bolsonaro, and also of agribusiness here in this region. And this has given rise to chasing original peoples off their lands and other communities as well, to just get rid of the trees and forests, to further the aims of this sector of capitalism, which remains very strong. And here I'm talking, of course, about agribusiness. And then there's the mining sector, there's agribusiness. But on top of this, one of the things that's really very serious is the building of what we call mega projects, hydroelectric dams, that have to do with the so-called sustainable energy, but which is actually not sustainable at all, because in order to build this type of energy production with hydroelectric dams, with the damming up of rivers, the requirement is to remove peoples and communities from their lands, from their forest areas, and ensure that the regions where these mega projects are built also include the building of many industrial areas, of industrial products, industrial production that has nothing to do with what is actually present on those territories. In fact, it has to do with has brought about the worsening of the health of the local communities, with the rise in prostitution of indigenous women, of peasant, small farmer women in these regions, who are expelled from their ecosystems and who have to live outside their original communities. So here in Brazil, the struggle against these genocidal policies and attacks from the Bolsonaro government, but also against policies of some local governments. All of this is tied up with other forms and types of struggle in defense of public health, in defense of women's lives, in defense of the biomes and ecosystems and of young people in these regions. It's not only an environmental question, as it were, or an ecological question only. Rather, it's a combination of all these struggles, which together bring about and are part of very strong resistance to these governments' attacks. And so I'd just like to focus on the question of the mining sector, the question of agribusiness, especially because there are people who think that in the Amazon region, meat production, cattle ranching is the worst. Oh, thanks, Simon, for that notification. Is the worst when it comes to defending the Amazon region. In fact, the so-called development projects, which are a threat to the Amazon, also have to do with soy production, with the mining sector, to just extract iron and other minerals using that are tied into the production of the most advanced technologies in the central countries of world capitalism. I think Simon was saying that one of the aims of this discussion here today is that we're on the eve of the COP in November, and eco-socialist activists here in Latin America wrote an article to contribute to thinking on what the eco-social struggle means against climate change, against climate warming, from the point of view of those who live in the territories, of those who endure attacks and who, in a situation where raw materials are extracted here to be used in the central countries of advanced capitalism in order to build so-called sustainable energy alternatives or technological solutions which claim to contribute to curbing global warming and the climate crisis more broadly. This is something that's really important to highlight, I think. We talked about fuels, the fossil fuels. We talked about fossil fuels, and perhaps one alternative, people say that one option could be electrical cars, but the first point is that electrical energy here in Brazil and in many parts of Latin America is very expensive, even though we have high levels of production of other types of energy. Nonetheless, people pay a very high price, while industry pays almost nothing for its energy use. And the technology that is used to manufacture other forms of transportation not using fossil fuels are technologies that use types of raw materials and minerals that are in the ground of our territories, and the mining sector comes in here to extract those minerals, those raw materials, and I've already described what that entails for the environment and the peoples here. And so the fight against the mining sector, the fight for the right to live on our lands, in our territories, because we know that food production In Brazil, 70% of food, 70% of food that's actually consumed in Brazil is the result of small farmer production, smallholders. It's not from agribusiness. And so the food that is produced in Brazil goes elsewhere, goes out to parts of the world. And they also become commodities traded on financial markets. They feed people that live outside Brazil. 70% of what we eat comes from small farmer production.
So when they are expelled from their plots, the food prices rise. That has to do with the fact that hunger has risen in Brazil. So Brazil, one of the bigger producers of food, now has famine in its population. So to wrap up, the eco-socialist struggle that have to do with the agribusiness, the attacks against the people in the territories is in fact a way of reflecting what do we do here in this part of the South, of the global South, and how can we have an alliance with the comrades in the north of the world to try and strengthen together our struggles. That is what I wanted to say, so thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Tárzia. That was really good. Thank you. And it's so important for us as socialists to be part of an international movement and to be part of and hear from struggles from workers and comrades around the world. So thank you so much for that. And good luck in the fight to overthrow one of the worst governments in the world today. So next we have Maggie, who again, I will give you these amazing signs that I have created just now. You have about 12 minutes.
Great, thank you very much, Simon, and hello everybody. I'm Maggie Chapman. I'm one of 7 Green MSPs, Green members of the Scottish Parliament, and I'm really pleased to be joining you this afternoon. Thank you to Terry for getting in touch and for inviting me along. I'm really sorry I couldn't join you for the whole day. As I said to Terry and a couple of others, we had our official opening ceremony of the Scottish Parliament this morning, and it was, as a Republican, it brought up many mixed emotions in me, because the Queen of the United Kingdom was here, and 2 other royals were here too. And yeah, as a Republican, that was quite hard. And I did think, you know, would I rather be talking with a whole load of other anti-capitalists or at their opening ceremony? But I think given that it'll be the only time in my life I get to do that, I'm sorry I went to that this morning. But I'm really pleased to be with you, and really pleased to be able to speak to you about a little bit about the Scottish context. We know that COP26 comes to Glasgow in just a month's time, and in many ways that's I think we all agree it's a watershed moment for humanity, it's a watershed moment for our planet, and we have an awful lot of work to do in the next 4 weeks, I think, as a movement, as a group of activists, and as a group of people who want a future. Never mind a better future, we want a future. So I'll speak a little bit about the Scottish context, and I'll speak a little bit about how that relates to some of the mobilisation around COP26 and some of the things that we are seeing here on the streets. But I just want to give you a little bit of background about the Scottish Greens, because I'm aware that I might be the only Scot here, and Scotland sometimes, when we look at the UK-wide news, it's the bit up north that very few people engage with. That's not a criticism, by the way. I've lived in Scotland how many years? For 23 years, I've never lived in England. I know nothing about England. I follow British politics, but you know as well as I do how skewed the media represents politics. So it's not a criticism, it's a fact of life. So the Scottish Greens are one of, we're a separate party to the Green Party of England and Wales and the Green Party of Northern Ireland, although we function as sister parties, not only within the UK, but within the European Federation of Green Parties. Our politics is based on four interacting and intersecting pillars, that of ecological wisdom or sustainability, social and economic justice, non-violence, and grassroots democracy. And different parties will express those in slightly different ways. But for me, that for me means that I'm an intersectional feminist, I'm an anti-capitalist, I'm an eco-socialist, and I'm an internationalist. I'm also the region I represent is the northeast of Scotland. So I'm a regional or list MSP. Scotland has, the Scottish Parliament has, it elects two types of MSPs, constituency MSPs, which are first past the post, and regional or list top-up additional member MSPs. And I am the Green MSP for the Northeast. The Northeast includes Aberdeen, which is the oil and gas capital of Europe, or certainly was the oil and gas capital of Europe. So it's a really, I think, quite important function, quite an important feature of our politics that we have a Green representing that region. It doesn't come without its challenges, because I'm one of 7 list MSPs. 4 of the other 7 list MSPs are Conservatives. So that gives you a little bit of an idea of the kind of balance or lack of balance that we have. But just to say a little bit about our Scottish context. So we have within Scotland, I think, our politics has become increasingly polarized over the last decade, primarily around the constitutional question, that of Scottish independence. Scottish Greens, along with the Scottish National Party, are the 2 parties in the Parliament that are pro-independence, and the Conservatives, Labour, and the Liberal Democrats are all pro-union, keeping the UK together because there's strength in that or something. I'm a very, very keen independent supporter and have campaigned quite strongly for that over the last decade. But I think why that matters is because we've seen that constitutional divide in our politics map onto so many other elements of political life in Scotland. So looking just at constitutional politics, we had a coalescence of what I think is a progressive bloc of politics around independence. So the Scottish Greens, the Scottish Socialists, which are a small party, they don't have national representation at the moment, the Scottish National Party and a couple of others are all pro-independence parties. And I think because you've got the Greens in there, because you've got the Socialists in there, it's made the vision for independence a left vision. On the other hand, you've got the pro-union bloc, which Conservatives, Liberal Democrats and Labour, the Tories have pulled the others to the right. And that feeds into all elements of our politics, and especially climate politics. So on one hand, we've got the left, which probably 20 or 30 years ago would have been arguing for the reopening of coal mines, is now very clearly in the climate action camp, and the pro-unionists, they very determined to keep oil and gas going. Very, very clear that actually climate action is a side issue, is not important. And in some ways, where we are in Scotland, the Scottish Greens have recently gone into government with a political cooperation agreement. It's not a full coalition, but a cooperation agreement with the Scottish National Party. And that's I think, represents a huge shift in SNP politics, because the SNP's previous leader, Alex Salmond, made his name as an oil economist. Before he moved into politics, he was an oil economist, and Scotland, the SNP sort of ran campaigns in the 60s and 70s and 80s on oil. You know, it's our oil was their slogan, and they made their political breakthrough in the 70s with that sort of position of maximum extraction, nationalist extractive capitalism in many ways. And over the last relatively few number of years, we've seen that shift, and Greens have been instrumental in that. That shift has gone through a kind of a green capitalism phase, and I think there are many in the SNP that are still in that green capitalism phase. But what we are trying to do, and why the green parliamentary role that we now have with ministers in the Scottish Government, is to shift that green capitalism into one of eco-socialism. And what we need to be seeing is, if you like, a popular front building up, coalescing around the resistance to austerity, the resistance to the Conservatives' sort of a-human and anti-human agenda, and of course resistance to climate change, to actually genuinely tackling the climate emergency, moving away from exploitative internationalist capitalist relations to a very, very different kind of state. And having COP26 in Glasgow, I think, gives us a tool, or gives us the context within which we can really be talking about that. So we've been able to get the ideas of just transition into common understanding, common language, maybe definitions. We still need to work on shared definitions a little bit, but there's a very, very clear sense that we can build on the plans of the socialists of the 1970s that got Lucas Aerospace to move away from manufacturing weapons to manufacturing useful goods. We need to do that same kind of shift away from oil and gas. And in our cooperation agreement with the SNP, we got them to promise £500 million worth of investment in the Northeast, including my region, for that just transition. Exactly what that will look like, I think that the devil will be in the detail, and we really need to make sure that we are in those discussions, in those conversations. But we've also got them to be thinking about other things as well that bring sort of social justice into the round, into the sense of climate justice as well. So things like rent controls, things like a very, very clear resistance to austerity, a sense that social security needs to be a fundamental universal right for all, regardless. And I think in some ways that the next 4 weeks then in the run up to COP give us an opportunity to make some of these connections. Because one of the reasons why I think left politics has failed to make the breakthrough that we really want to have made by now is because of the sort of the siloing or the compartmentalizing of different elements of society. And the climate emergency, the nature emergency really give us the opportunity to break all of those boundaries, break those silos down, because we need to really allow people to make the connections between workers' rights and tackling the climate emergency, between rent controls and appropriate living conditions for people, and living in warm, draft-proof homes that don't cost the earth to heat. All of those kinds of things are one of the ways that are ways that we are trying to bring into the wider context of Scottish politics. And in some ways, COP26 allows us to focus in on that. We have just in, I know I've only got a couple of minutes left, but just in closing, we are really, really keen to be the sort of parliamentary voice of that quite radical revolutionary climate action or climate activism group. And as we've said a few times, for Greens, what we want is to maintain 1 foot in Parliament and 1 foot on the streets. And Extinction Rebellion and others have been very much a part of getting us to where we are. And we hope that over the next 4 weeks and then beyond COP26, we'll really be able to galvanize some of those connections and so really bringing in what is one of our 4 pillars, that grassroots democracy, grassroots activism, and grassroots voices into our political sphere, because I think we can all recognize that that's what's been so grossly absent for so long. So I hope that gives you a little bit of background, a little bit of context. Really interested to hear the questions, and I think there's a lot of potential crossover in some of the themes that Tárzia was talking about as well. So happy to hear questions, happy to hear discussion. Thank you very much again for having me.
Brilliant, thank you very much, Maggie. We've got around 20 minutes because I want to give speakers time to come back for a few minutes, and also in case there's any announcements of any other things coming up that people might be interested in. So I'll take speakers now, people who want to ask questions, people who have got a contribution to make. If you could try and keep it to around 3 minutes, that would be very good. If you want to say something, but don't want to take up speaking time, then you could just write it in the chat and everyone can read it there. Having said that, no one's put their hands up yet, so who's going to be first? Joseph.
Yeah, hello, Maggie. Good to hear from you. I met you a number of years ago. I don't know if you remember, but in Edinburgh, actually. So I just wanted to ask about just transition, but also in the context of the war economy, because we know that the Trident nuclear bases are in Scotland and so on. Now, there's been some discussion about, in the event of Scottish independence, that the UK would control those ports as a sovereign, some sort of sovereign military territory or something like that. Obviously, in the context of the UK state viewing itself as an imperial power, those sort of sites are going to be very important to it. I just wanted to say, you mentioned oil and gas and so on, but how would you see also the arms industry and things like that in Scotland developing with your coalition?
Thank you, Joseph. Zbizek next.
Yeah, I've got a question for Maggie about looking at the question of alternative economics that the Green Party might be following, and specifically that's been plugged by Kay Raworth of donut economics, which looks at the whole context. Instead of growth being based on GDP, a more moral economics that looks at the interaction with warming and the global context and of humans in the Anthropocene. So I wondered if that's one thing. And then another question to our comrade from Brazil. Again, the question of what are the political alternatives being expressed in her organization, and do they look back at the Allende government, which had a planned economy and one that was socially responsible with the environment of the Amazon? Okay, that's 2 questions, 1 to each speaker.
Thank you very much. Terry.
Thanks, Simon, and thanks to Tárzia and Maggie for fascinating contributions. 3 things very quickly. First of all, I think it's important to say that in terms of the movement around COP26, I think one of the things that's impressive about the coalition is the extent to which it fronts and centres the question of climate justice and reparations. Those banners will certainly lead the London demonstration, and I'm sure will be very prominent on the Glasgow demo. And for me, that's quite a big shift in the climate movement in this country. These countries, one should say. I've not seen that happen on these islands, and I've been mobilising around COPs for more years than I care to remember. So I think that's politically important and marks the centrality of the sort of contribution that Tárzia has made. Secondly, specific questions. Firstly, to Tárzia, even if you haven't got it to hand, I don't think I've seen the document that you mentioned from Latin American comrades around eco-socialism, and it would be really great to have that. And if it's not yet been translated into English, to make sure that happens urgently. Secondly, you talked about the World March of Women. It would be interesting if you could say just a couple of sentences about the role of women in the climate movement. Seems to me that women are very, very often on the front end of organising, particularly when you're talking about defending communities. And I think it's something that isn't highlighted often enough. And then to Maggie, it seems to me one of the interesting things about Scottish politics that many people in the rest of Britain don't understand is the importance of the land question. And when Tárzia was talking about struggles over land, it struck me that it would be interesting to have a contribution, you know, some thought around that.
Thank you, Terry. Danny is next, followed by Imbar.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, just a question for Tárzia. Tárzia was talking about trying to find ways for progressive campaigns in Brazil to engage the sympathies and support of the left and trade unions in the West. And of course, in cases like this, conventionally, our first response typically would be to organise some kind of a boycott. And I wondered whether or not, with respect to the types of mineral extraction which Tárzia describes as being predatory and leading to original peoples and others being driven from their lands, Tárzia is envisaging that workers in Brazil would welcome attempts by unions and others in the UK and elsewhere to organise some kind of boycott. Or is there a sense that boycotts would be unhelpful and potentially cause a further deterioration in the terms and conditions of people in that part of the world? I mean, it's not something that we can judge at this distance, but something perhaps we could be advised on. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Danny. Imbar, you're next.
Yeah, it's very interesting what people, Tárzia was saying about the agricultural, and there were 2 points. Kind of, first of all, I was interested that most of it is small farmers, because so much around the world, farms are controlled by big business, and it is rare to find a country that it is mainly small farmers. So that is very interesting. The other thing that I wanted to highlight, the fact that the way that meat uses production of meat uses very wasteful, basically, way of producing food has been highlighted many years ago in the 70s and the early 70s, and it is just, I find it astonishing that it takes so long to kind of make changes of habit change and diet change. I mean, I have actually I have met a number of people from South America, and I don't think it is very common to have the alternative to meat diet. And I don't know if it has been discussed at all from an environmental point of view, so it'll be useful to know. Thanks.
Thanks, Imbar. Chris.
Hi, it's a question about the situation in Brazil. You've talked about the problems that you're up against and what you're fighting against, but does there exist an alternative voice within the Brazilian political system that is actually going to be looking at a greener, more sustainable, less capitalist situation. I mean, I say this, I lived in Brazil from 2001 to 2005. So I was there, not only did I attend the PSOL founding conference, but I was actually there when Lula's government came in and very rapidly went into crisis at that time. And I wonder if there's ever been a re-emergence of anything at a governmental, political level that's radically alternative to what's actually going on with Bolsonaro.
Thanks, Chris. Jeff.
On question of Trident, it was certainly being mooted a few weeks ago that if Scotland refused to have Trident missiles stationed in an independent Scotland, they could be transferred to Wales. Now, my understanding is that that has been completely rejected. The idea of them going to Milford Haven, which is one of the biggest oil refineries, I think persuaded the Johnson government that this wasn't a particularly bright idea. So I don't know where they would go actually if they were thrown out of Scotland. Just on, I mean, Terry's right on land question. That's also a big issue in Wales, something that in Dodd I know has been taking up. And in Wales, of course, it's tied up very much with language questions. Thanks. Sure.
Thanks, Jeff. I don't see any other hands at the moment, so that might give our speakers, there's been a series of questions, so it gives our speakers a little bit more time to go over some of the answers. So what I'll do is I'll take Maggie first, if that's okay, Maggie. You've got about 8 minutes or something like that, 8 or 9 minutes, and then Tárzia second. So Maggie, would you like to begin?
Thanks, Simon, and thanks for those questions. Some great questions there. Please prompt me if I forget anything. I was trying to make notes as people were saying, but I might have missed something. On the issue of nuclear weapons, Trident and land, I think in some ways, well, the Scottish Green position is very, very clear. We are anti-nuclear. We want we want countries to sign up to the treaty against the proliferation of nuclear weapons, and we see an independent Scotland as being nuclear free. The SNP share that vision, share some of that vision, I think, around nuclear weapons themselves. Maybe not so much around membership of NATO. Well, that is one of the things that we know we disagree on. The SNP changed its policy to be in favor of NATO membership. But I think there's a very, very clear understanding within the pro-union, pro-independence movement that actually an independent Scotland would not have Trident. We maybe lazily don't necessarily have an answer of what should happen to Trident or where it goes. I think the sort of underlying or implicit answer is that Trident should be decommissioned completely and not renewed, and that defence money freed up for social good. And I think that is shared across both the Scottish Greens and the Scottish National Party. In terms of moving it elsewhere, it's a matter of surprise for me, actually, that it's not something the UK government seem to be more concerned about, as they follow through with socially regressive policies like cutting the universal credit payment by £20 next week. That cut is coming in, and other things. It just drives the wedge between the Scottish people and UK politics even deeper. And I think if we get a very, very clear commitment of the independence prospectus being anti-nuclear, then there will have to be some kind of shift on that from the UK government's point of view, because I don't see a future where there is this little UK or rest of the UK compartmentalization of Helensburgh and the Faslane base, which is on the west coast of Scotland, not far from Glasgow. I think independence actually gives the peace and anti-nuclear movement a real boost. You know, it creates a huge schism in nuclear politics to say we need rid of these things, we need to decommission them. And to go back to the very first question, I think there's something for me quite profound about learning from the Lucas Aerospace example of the 1970s, when workers just down tools and said, no, we are not going to manufacture weapons. We will turn our manufacturing capabilities into manufacturing things that are useful. And so we need to be engaging with trade unions, we need to be engaging with the workers at the Faslane base and say, actually, just think what we could be doing. You know, if we get the British military out, what else could we be doing with your skills, with your ingenuity and your creativity, and how can we make that into a non-nuclear future? That's not going to be easy, but I think it has to be a crucial element of our next, and I hope our last, independence campaign. Linking that into some of the broader land questions, I think Terry makes the very good point that land ownership is hugely complex, or creates so many complexities for local politics. That is very true in Scotland. We have some of the Duke of Buccleuch owns too much of Scotland. He owns massive estates. I should know the value, and I'm sorry, I can't remember it. But one of the things that we want as part of our radical democratic future for an independent Scotland is a very clear nationalising or communitising of land being there for people, for local communities. And we've started to make little chips into that. So the Scottish Parliament passed landmark legislation in the early 2000s on community right to buy, and that now covers both rural and urban communities. It started out only in rural communities, and now it's shifted into urban communities too. I think one of the campaigns that we have on our hands is to shift that not only into the right to buy, but the demand to buy, because there has to be that element of community ownership or public ownership, some form of public ownership of Scotland's assets, especially when we are looking at the kind of future that we know we need to see, that is reliant on renewable energy. That means freeing up our land for onshore wind farms, that kind of thing, and the value, that the benefit of that going back into the communities, not being offshored into an energy company owned by a landowner somewhere on the other side of the world. So there's those elements of democracy and of local democracy that are key in that. To touch briefly on alternative economics and donut economics, yes, it's very much a key element of what we are trying to do. In that shift that I mentioned from green capitalism to the work that's now cut out for us around green socialism, we have a commitment from the Scottish Government, the SNP Scottish Government, to talk about well-being, a well-being economy, to look at measures other than GDP as markers of health and resilience and all of those things. And I think we, in many ways, and I'm sorry I missed the degrowth workshop, because I think I would have been really interested to hear that. But I think that it's about shifting the narrative around what growth means and what prosperity means and what resilience means. And there's a lot of sloppiness and a lot of laziness, I think, in political discourse, where people mean well-being and prosperity and they say growth. And we need to be very clear about what it is we are talking about when we talk about well-being, what it is we are talking about when we are talking about resilience, and what we mean by prosperous and well-off communities of the future. And that doesn't have to rely on the sort of neoclassical economic model of growth. So there's a lot of work for us to do, and I think in some ways the next 5 years that we have, the next parliamentary term, 4.5 years now, will be the marker of whether Greens have been successful in that or not. But that coalition of movement building that I talked about earlier will hopefully allow us to make inroads into those issues. Sorry, that was quite a whistle-stop answer, but I'll stop there.
Great work, Maggie. Brilliant. Thank you. Okay, finally, we will wrap up with Tárzia. So don't forget the translation button at the bottom of the app. Hello.
Tengo que poner a Simon en mi pantalla para ver.
I have to put Simon on my screen so I can see him. How many minutes do I have?
9 minutes.
9 minutes. Ok. Bueno, hay un montón de preguntas acá. No sé si.
Well, there are a lot of questions here. I don't know if I'll be able to answer all of them. I really liked the questions that came up. I think that we do have a complex situation, not just in Brazil. It's all over Latin America as well. I think that what some of the comrades asked, in the PSOL, my organization, as well as in other environmentalist and eco-socialist movements in Brazil, we question this ourselves on the political alternatives from the eco-socialist and environmentalist struggle, and how does this relate back to the Bolsonaro government? Well, I think that today, as we know, this government has at the center of its political project from the presidency of Brazil, attacks against all aspects related to biomes and ecosystems in Brazil. We think that the struggles against Bolsonaro are very closely related to the struggles against the government of Bolsonaro. There is no saying that on one side we want to take Bolsonaro down, and then on the other side we're fighting for the territories. They both go together. And so, as Terry mentioned, and as I mentioned before, indigenous people and native communities in Brazil, and also women, are subjects that are at the center of these struggles. These people and these subjects have the main roles in defending the nature, in defending the territories, in defending the common resources of nature. We understand those as common resources of humanity. And so these resources aren't to be exploited, but are to be preserved, because our existence depends on them. And so women, mainly farmer women, indigenous women, but also women on the periphery of big cities, which are also disputed territories of capitalism, those women are the ones that are developing the most interesting experiences of resistance against Bolsonaro, but also against local governments that are trying to expel them from their homes and from their territories. And so they're trying to keep up the struggle for the preservation of those territories. That is why, as Terry said, it is important to take into account that here in Brazil, we have seen it, we have built many manifestations such as the Daisies March, which has been the biggest women march in Latin America, organized by farmer women in Brazil. That happened in August of this year. And then there was the Indigenous Women March, which happened a few weeks ago in the capital of Brazil. The Indigenous women organized that from all across the country. And they also had an assembly of those women to talk about alternatives, to keep struggling, to keep fighting for the territories, for the people, and against the government of Bolsonaro. And so there is no doubt that in socialist, environmentalist movements in Brazil, women, indigenous communities are at the center of the fight. They have an interesting point of view for climate justice and as a resistance for the movement, for their struggles. I was interested in Denny's, I think that's the name, question when they asked about what are the alternatives, what are the political movements that exist in the north against the exploitation of minerals. We, in fact, have that as a challenge here. We are debating what or which could be the processes of transitions in the jobs that have to do with industrial work. And how do we handle the sectors, the people that work in these sectors? And how, if we take down that industry, how are we going to replace those jobs? That is a big challenge for us here in Brazil. And so we have to think about that. The pandemic really made us reflect on that. We need to think about the changes to advance in an eco-socialist perspective of jobs, of work, so that we put the human needs above the market needs. We as educators know that it can be possible because we've had harder campaigns here in Latin America, but today with automation of industries, most of the population of Brazil are out of their jobs, even out of industrial jobs, because it is mostly automated now. I think it is a challenge, but it's not going to be that hard because these people are already suffering the impact of these predatory activities in their daily lives. So it is a challenge, but we are ready to take on these campaigns. I think I have a minute left, so I would like to talk about the food systems and the challenges that we have. We need to take into account, of course, the farmers when we talk about this. Yes, we have to think about campaigns and alternatives. Farmer organizations have been saying for many years, supported by the United Nations Food Organization, that the production of the farmers is enough to feed the world. we don't need the food that is produced by agribusiness. We don't need that to feed people anywhere. The production of food that is from the farmers is healthy, is food that is not poisoned, that doesn't use pesticides. And it would be enough to feed the entire world. We call this zero food. Or it's food that is produced, sorry, that is consumed close to where it was produced. And this has to do with, waste of food, which would be zero, because people would produce food to be consumed close to where they produce by people who live, close to where they produce it. Farmers are poorly organized, but the few organizations that still exist, they're trying to fight in the global south. In the global north, there are still some farmer organizations, and the relationship that exists between city and country is important. So we need those relationships to strengthen. That would be the alternative to match people that cannot produce their own food with people that can produce that food, so that we can have a more sustainable way of living, so that we can, have more climate justice, to have more social justice, and to strengthen the identity of farmers as well. And so here we think that the alliance between city and the countryside is still a way of struggling and of organizing the food production, which is way more viable from a humane vision, and of course to protect nature as well. To wrap up, of course we have many difficulties here in Brazil, but we cannot forget that Brazil is one of the countries of the world that kills environmentalist leaders the most. So fighting for the environment, for nature, for the territories, for common resources is a risk here under a Bolsonaro government. And so we cannot allow this crime to continue. This happens on a daily basis. That is a risk. And we do not take that lightly. So we want to take this to the COP26. Yes, we need climate justice, but this has to do as well with the right to fight, with the right to fight for, for farmers, for the environment, for nature. There are some sectors which we call Bolsonarists that are organized to kill farmers, to kill leaders in their communities. So becoming an activist here in Brazil isn't easy. Not even for people who live in the city, it's easy. So that is a bit of what I wanted to talk about. And of course, we are open for any other discussions that you may want to have. If you want to exchange some sort of information, I'm going to write my my email here in the chat in case somebody wants to email me some more questions or maybe want to keep in touch. You can email me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tárzia. That was brilliant. So thank you for all of our speakers who came today and the excellent contributions from people at Critical University. We hold these semi-regularly, so please keep a lookout in your inboxes for the next meeting. If you haven't joined Anti-Capitalist Resistance yet, there is still opportunity to do so. We are accepting new members. We're always accepting new members. We also have our conference in mid-December, where we're going to be looking at consolidating the organisation more. We're still quite a new organisation. We've been around for less than a year, kind of formally constituted. So now's a great time to join and get involved in shaping the politics and also the structures of the organisation. As I mentioned before, COP26 is coming up. And as the saying goes, environmentalism without class struggle is just gardening. So we'll be out on the streets campaigning, making the arguments to try and push the COP26 the COP process as radical as it can go, whilst also pointing out some of the structural problems of capitalism and imperialism in being able to deal with the climate catastrophe which is looming over us. So thank you all for coming today. And I hope to see you all very soon. And if you're going out today and it's raining where you are, as it is where I am, please don't get too wet. Take care, everyone.